Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld live stream. It is Friday evening, the 23rd of August 2019. And tonight's topic, a timely one, is the Fed really the enemy? And today's events provide us with a clue as Trump lashes out at China while the Fed is conducting independent monetary policy. Can monetary and fiscal policies be synced if there is an independent Fed? Now, these are questions that are very important, and we can see just by today's event how important they are. Now, the world takes for granted, or at least the U.S. people in the United States take for granted, other than people who read anti-Fed diatribes, that somehow the Fed is part of the three branches of government and it's part of the checks and balances. No such thing. Before we get into what happened today, just briefly, what is the Fed? The Fed was a creation of Congress, but it's unlike any other central bank in the world, in a major country, in that it is independent, meaning that it's not run by the Treasury. So, for example, the National Bank of X country is run by that country. National Bank of Sweden, National Bank of Brazil, whatever it is, they conduct monetary and fiscal policy. For those who get those terms confused, you're in good company. John Kennedy often confused the two during his cabinet meetings. He'd say, which one is monetary policy and which one is the fiscal policy. And the fiscal policy is what Congress does, the spending, and monetary policy is what the bank does on interest rates. Okay, so the United States has this very, very strange, we're not getting into the history of it, but some say it's a corrupt system because it's run by bankers for the benefit of the bankers, even though it's supposed to be for the benefit of the United States. The idea is that you have independent monetary policy. They're going to do the right thing. Well, as we saw in 2008, the right thing was bailing out the banks. So that may not have been what a treasury might have done. And not only did they bail out the banks, very interestingly, it's one thing to bail out the banks, it's another to make the banks whole. So remember, half of the QE that was printed up and sent out half of it was to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which, okay, we can understand if that's what they're going to do. It's the part of the government bonds they're buying. Other central banks do that. I'm not endorsing it, but it makes sense. But to make a private bank whole for some crappy mortgage debt that they owned and to give them 100% on the dollar, well, that looks like a lot of self-dealing. Okay, so the central bank in general is probably not a bad idea. A lot of people get it stuck in their head, and the Fed, and they talk about Andrew Jackson ending the central banks. Central banks, in theory, not in practice, can be a good thing if they're prudent and they're really only used as a bank of last resort. Even with a gold standard, if you have issues where the gold reserves are not matching what they need to have as part of their good prudent measurement, and which would otherwise cause a bank run, well, the central bank could provide liquidity, act as, instead of having the bank fail, can provide the liquidity. So a central bank isn't necessarily a bad thing if it really is a backstop bank and not one that's in charge of running the economy. And in the case of the Fed, it's supposedly running the world's economy. Because remember, the central bank of the United States, the Fed, has the dual mandate for stable prices and full employment, which means they can do anything in the name of full employment. I don't know why the Fed would have that power and why the Congress granted that to them, I think in 1978, 1979, as if the Fed could do something about that. So that's basically central banks that are either run by a country, which makes sense, the Central Bank of Sweden, the Central Bank of Denmark, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan. We don't have the Bank of America. We have a Federal Reserve. It's not part of the federal government. Its officers are appointed by the government. But let's just remember what Alan Greenspan said, and he said this many times. This isn't the best clip, but he gets the point across that the Fed truly is untouchable. Listen to what he has to say here.
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take.
Okay, so basically the Fed, there's no actions that can be overruled if the Fed takes an action. Now, if the president does something, we all know from civics, Congress can overrule what they do, right? They could 2/3 vote and the veto is gone away. Other way around, Congress does something, the president can veto it, and it doesn't get overruled. So the Fed actually has this position where it's not elected, it's not part of the government, and yet it binds the United States' entire monetary policy, in some respects, the world. And we've seen how some people would say they self-deal and they help out their banker buddies. Now, they do have to keep a stable dollar, and that is their number one goal. And the reason, I've never gone off with it, they're going to destroy the dollar to help the stock market. No, when they don't have the dollar to play around with, then they don't have anything. So they'll always try to protect the dollar. We're going to get into that. But let's talk about what happened today. And this is why it's come to a head here now. This and the Fed, because of what they do, yeah, well, as Greenspan says, you can't really stop them, and they flaunt that. But Trump is taking this to a next level. It's not about a gold standard. It's not about whether they do QE or not, or they lower interest rates. It's basically that a president of a country or a Congress or a prime minister generally likes to have the tools of government at their disposal, subject to, of course, checks and balances. But in the Fed's case, it was patently obvious today what happened. Let's review what happened today, and then you'll see why Trump is actually making a very good argument, although it doesn't appear that way, to be ending the Fed, at least in the way we have it now. Not getting rid of a central bank, but ending this independent type of central bank that is basically, as Greenspan says, beyond reproach and cannot be second-guessed and cannot be overruled. So, there was a lot of, we've been having the trade tensions between China and the United States. And Trump is leading those negotiations. He's putting tariffs on China. China's putting tariffs on the United States. Trump recently said, okay, we'll hold off on a certain round of tariffs until Christmas. And then China came back and I think yesterday or this morning said, we're going to put tariffs on a lot of items. Trump wanted to respond, and he did. But the whole world now is focused, or was focused in the last week, on what Jerome Powell might say at Jackson Hole. And he spoke today, and everybody was waiting to hear what he had to say. Now, remember, the president has no control over what he does or what he says because the Fed is independent. Nixon went through this with Arthur Burns, his Fed chair, and he used to bring him into his office and browbeat him and say, what are you doing? You got to lower rates. I got to get reelected. And, of course, Arthur Burns wrote a diary, very interesting book, Inside the Nixon Administration, The Secret Diary of Arthur Burns. And Nixon actually had a good control on the Fed. The Fed wasn't as independent as they thought because Nixon really took them to task. But right now we know that during the trade war, what China's doing is they're letting the yuan be devalued. And that's helping subsidize their losses because of the tariffs that the United States has put on. So Trump has been saying, hey, enough is enough. Trump wants now a weaker dollar to offset China's weakening of the yuan. And Kudlow, Trump's economic advisor, he went full cutard today, just before Chairman Powell spoke, and he says, I think the handwriting's on the wall for lower rates, and he's predicting a series of interest rate cuts to come. Now remember, we talked about 2 nights ago with the Fed's minutes. And that's another thing about the Fed. They released the minutes like 2 or 3 weeks after they've had their meeting and after they made their decision. Now, you never even used to do that. So now there's some transparency into what the Fed does. The Fed hasn't been audited. So you could see how this is a problem, especially when there is some conflict between either the administration, the executive branch, the president, or the Congress. And right now the president is having an issue with the way the Fed is conducting policy because what they said in those minutes when they cut rates was this is not a This is just a mid-cycle adjustment, meaning we're not really now going to start lowering interest rates. This was just something we did just because, and if you remember, we didn't really think that those minutes made a stitch of sense why they would have lowered rates based on all the information they put out in the minutes. But Kudlow and the president are pressuring the Fed to say, look, we want to lower interest rates that'll bring the dollar down. We're going to talk about what this means for gold, silver, and cryptocurrencies towards the end of the program, so just bear with me. So Kudlow is thinking, yeah, he's predicting a series of interest rates cuts coming. Now, if you think about this, this is the whole world, and trillions and billions of dollars, billionaires and trillionaires, are going to make their moves based on what this guy, Jerome Powell, has to say during his speech at Jackson Hole. I mean, this is the definition of centralization, single point of failure, and this guy's not even elected. And he really doesn't have to face any consequences of his actions. He's just the guy, the head of the Federal Reserve. None of them do. They don't have to get reelected. Very hard to remove them. Hundreds of billions of dollars set to move based on what this one guy says or doesn't say. And the people are analyzing what Fed Chairman Powell's going to say. Now, part of the reason that Trump doesn't like this is he's not calling the shots. And I can understand that. But he's got a right to call the shots. He got elected. But then, of course, he appointed this guy. But everybody was waiting today to see what would happen, whether it would be thumbs up or thumbs down. And Trump was painfully aware of this. And here's where the issue is with all this. Because while, if you look at the minutes, the Fed is driving in the dark. I'm in the dark here. They're driving blind because they make references to the trade wars. They don't know how the trade wars might play out. They don't know what they might do preemptively or in reaction to a type of move, but they're not privy to what's going on. They're independent. They don't know what Trump is going to do. They don't know what the administration is going to do. They don't really even know what Congress is going to do in terms of tax hikes, tax cuts. They kind of find out about it in the paper, just like everyone else. But what happened this morning, as I mentioned, China all of a sudden threw a monkey wrench in the whole thing, and they put 25% tariffs on U.S. autos. They're going to put tariffs on 5,078 U.S. products. That's probably all the products they import. And they'll go into effect on September 1st and December 15th. They're going to put another 5% tariff on soybeans. Now, forget the efficacy of doing this. I think this is a pretty dumb move on China. This is shooting themselves in the foot because while they export a lot of goods to the United States and it's very beneficial for them to do so, they make a lot of money on it and they keep all those people employed. The stuff that they actually import from the United States, they need oil, they need soybeans, they need those types of things, but they're now in full-on trade war, and so $75 billion worth of goods, and of course Trump is free to negotiate, so when he hears this, he says to himself, okay, that's it, I've had enough of China, and he is going to rip into China when he sees this. But meanwhile, in the interim, when he's putting together his counter to what China has done with its tariffs, everybody's got to wait to hear what this guy, Jerome Powell, has to say. So the world is waiting on Jerome Powell, and he's the important figure, and what he says is what's going to move the markets. Is he going to indicate dovish monetary policy, no change, wait and see, aggressive, hawkish monetary policy? Where does he see the economy going? What's he going to say at Jackson Hole? All right. But Trump has got more important things to worry about, but he has this Powell guy out there. And he starts in. He says, look, now the Fed can show their stuff. After Powell speaks, Trump tweets, as usual, the Fed did nothing. The Fed's not supposed to do anything at Jackson Hole. It's incredible they can, quote unquote, speak without knowing or asking what I'm doing. Stop. That's a very important point. It is incredible that the Fed is out there First of all, having all this power, conducting monetary policy that will impact the United States, the dollar, the rest of the world, the rest of the world's economy, and they don't know what Trump is doing with something that is going to also affect the world's economy, which is trade negotiations and trade war with China. And then he says, they don't know, without knowing or asking what I'm doing, which will be announced shortly. So he has planned, once he sees what China has done with tariffs, while Powell is going to give his speech, Trump is sharpening his pencil and coming up with a counter. And Powell's going to go out and give a speech and pontificate about the state of the world's economy and what the Fed's going to do about it. He says we have a very strong dollar and a very weak Fed. I will work brilliantly with both, and the U.S. will do great. Now, watch what happens where the real problem comes in. My only question is, in working with the Fed and China, who is our bigger enemy? Jay Powell, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, or Chairman Xi, Chairman of the Communist Party of China, President of China? Now that is a stunning statement for a president to make. Not, I'm having problems like Nixon with Arthur Burns, but tweeting out that Jay Powell is an enemy. We just don't know whether he's a bigger enemy than Chairman Xi. And why does he think this? Because he doesn't agree with Jay Powell's point of view. He wants to be able to tell Powell, lower interest rates. I want a cheaper dollar. I need that in my arsenal to fight against China. And you're out there on the one hand and on the other hand, and the committee believes, and let's have a meeting and let's talk about purchasing assets someday in the future. We're looking forward. Remember the other night we talked about this? That was all that was on their mind, is how they were going to dig back into their tool chest, because they learned so well over the last 10 years how to print money and spread the wealth around, as Obama would say. And meanwhile, Trump's thinking the most important thing he's got going on is this China negotiation. So, the problem with the independent Fed, this is the crux of the matter. As he says, the Fed did nothing. It's incredible they can speak without knowing or asking what I'm doing, which I'm going to announce in a few minutes. Trump was highlighting this weakness, this much praised independence of the Fed. This is a flaw, not a feature. Because not only can the Fed do things like self-dealing, like we saw, maybe that wasn't the best way to go about the financial crisis, was to just bail out the banks. Maybe Congress and the president would have come up with a different way, or they wouldn't have been browbeat by the Fed to do it the way they did it. But what about where the Fed can actually be useful in helping in a national goal, which is, okay, the United States is in a trade war with China. You don't think that President Xi doesn't say, okay, go over there and you get that yuan down, and then his People's Bank of China goes and does what they need to do that. I mean, most central banks, all of them, the big ones, are controlled by their governments, and they can instruct them what to do. Now, Europe's a little different now because ECB's taken over a lot of the central bank functions of the Bank of Italy, the Bank of France, the Bank of Germany, the Bundesbank, and so on. But in most cases, the central bank, like the Bank of Japan, when they talk about Abenomics, everything is all together. The premier, the prime minister, the central bank, they work together. Trump can't do that. But here's a case where the Fed could be working at cross purposes. I wrote my tweet close purposes. They could be working with close purposes if they were together. But the Fed could be doing things that are actually undermining Trump, either intentionally, unintentionally, unwittingly, just because they don't know what's going on or they think they know what's going on. And they can still conduct their independent policy. They can get infiltrated by the Chi-Coms. And they say, okay, Trump wants a cheaper dollar. We're going to raise rates that'll push the dollar higher. As I mentioned, other countries' central banks work closely with their administrations. They're part of the Treasury. We don't have that. Now, just because, see, people that want to end the Fed, they're like, well, if we end the Fed, then we won't have all this profligacy. No, wrong goes star. If a country is run by its own central bank and the politicians run it, they'll spend just as much. It's just where it goes. Anyone who's in charge of the money supply and they have popular demand, as Mises says, the public always wants cheap money. You want lower interest rates, so you can borrow cheaply. You don't want higher interest rates. Now, the thing is, they say, well, with an independent central bank, they're not going to be beholden to that. Well, yeah, they're not going to be beholden to what the public wants, but if the other banks want lower rates, well, they're going to give them to them. So we do have this issue now. It's a very important issue that the Fed right now is actually working at cross purposes, according to Trump, to the point where he's calling the Fed chair an enemy. On par, and that's the first time he's also called Chairman Xi an enemy. He's been calling him a good friend of his. He's got a great relationship and so on. So, Powell speaks. Trump says, WTF, you don't know what I'm doing, you don't know what I'm thinking, and you're out there conducting monetary policy. What does Trump do? Not only does he say, I'm going to do something, he lays a couple of bombshells down, and he says, our country has lost, stupidly, trillions of dollars with China over many years. They've stolen our intellectual property at a rate of hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and they want to continue. I won't let that happen. We don't need China. And frankly, would be far better off without them. Now, this is the first time he's kind of acted coy and aloof with China. Well, we get a deal, it doesn't matter if we do, if we don't. He's talked like that, but now he's basically saying, screw them. We don't need them at all. I don't want to know you. The vast amounts of money made and stolen by China from the United States year after year for decades will and must stop, says Trump. Our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for an alternative to China. Now, it would have been useful if Powell knew that this is what Trump was planning. Now, this ditched the markets today down, the markets were down 623 points. That's 2.37%. NASDAQ down 3%. For those people who trade cryptocurrencies, this is nothing. Something's down 2 or 3%. But for stock markets, that's a big deal. For silver, people in silver are used to silver dropping 3 or 4% in a day. But this is a big deal for the stock market to go down that much. And the stock market was up going into this. Why? They were focused on Powell. And Powell might be dovish. And if Powell is dovish, well, that's a good thing, as Bernie would say. And Powell was relatively dovish and did indicate that they would, in a sense, do what it takes to make sure that they can keep the global economies from falling into recession. And then Trump comes out and says, okay, screw China. Our great American companies are hereby ordered to immediately start looking for alternatives to China, including bringing their companies, bringing your companies home and making your products in the United States. Now, first of all, this is a very nationalistic view. This is what other countries do. This is when China will direct. I think it was the word nationalist that got me cut off there. I said this is a very nationalist thing for Trump to be doing. We've seen this in other countries where the countries direct their economies. But we've seen it in the United States. We've seen Truman try to nationalize the steel mills. We've seen Roosevelt. But many presidents have tried to commandeer. And there's an executive order that Obama had where basically you can commandeer all of the resources in the country in a national emergency. So the point here is that Trump is saying he wants U.S. companies out of China. Now, he says you're ordered to do this, but this isn't an executive order. It's an executive tweet. I will be responding to China's tariffs this afternoon. This is a great opportunity for the United States. I am also ordering, by tweet. I haven't seen maybe he did an executive order later in the day. I'll check. I'm ordering all carriers, including FedEx, Amazon, UPS, and Post Office, for search and refuse all deliveries of fentanyl from China or anywhere else. Fentanyl kills 100,000 Americans a year. President Xi said this would stop. It didn't. Our economy, because of its gains in the last 2 years, is much larger than China, and we will keep it that way. So now we've seen what the issue is. That the Fed, in a crisis, in a national emergency, has no obligation to work with any of the branches of government. it can just decide, you know what, it's good, it's bad for the United States, but if it helps Goldman Sachs and it helps the ECB, that's what we're going to do. Why? We think that's what's best. That's what Greenspan was saying. No one can second guess us. We're independent. I mean, you can't vote them out. You can only boot them out after their terms are over. But here's now what all this means for gold and silver. Got to bring it back to gold and silver and cryptocurrencies. If you remember, when they did QE, the third QE in 2012, September, everyone, including myself, thought, that's it. I mean, they just did 2 QEs. Gold had gotten to $1,911 in 2011. It fell off a bit by 2012. Not too much. Silver had fallen a bit from its $50 high. But when they did QE3, I thought, that's going to reignite. And this is it. The profligacy is in. They're just going to blow money. It's open-ended. This is the biggest QE they've done. And actually, gold and silver fell further. Obama had that meeting with the bankers after the QE3 was announced around that same time. And it looked like the United States was concerned, as everyone was, China was, that the United States was going to devalue the dollar and devalue their treasury holdings. And by doing so, it was going to cause a problem. The United States was well aware of that. Now, gold pumpers they've been in this 2012, 2013 mindset. They're still in it. They still think that China's going to crush the dollar and the dollar's days are numbered and everyone's de-dollarizing and the United States is just blowing money and they print money and China produces. Yeah, that was true in 2012. The U.S. was the outlier. The U.S. was the one that was now on its third QE. But one of the things I said in 2013 was 2014, the Fed knows they have to stop this. Not only do they have to stop it, they got to convince other countries to do what they just did and do even more. That's exactly what they did. That's why I said the Fed would raise rates. Everyone was, they never can raise rates. They can't raise rates. Sure they can. They needed to raise rates to put some space between them and the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the ECB, China, and all the other countries, all the other central banks, Bank of England, ECB, Bank of Japan, all engaged and embarked on their own QEs, bigger and better than the United States, the Fed's ever was, lowered their interest rates below zero. Now, that solidifies dollar hegemony. Remember, end of dollar hegemony, multipolar world, all this BS that the gold pumpers are saying, because that's exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to make sure they had to put treasury bonds on sale, raise interest rates. Yes. If they're finally, it's dawned on people 6 years later since I've been talking about this, is why would you buy a German bond today at a negative rate when you could buy a treasury at 1.5%, 2%? Yeah, that's the reason. The dollar needed the whole system. The Fed realized that's their main game. If they don't have that, they don't have anything. Then they can't direct money where they want to. They have to protect dollars and they have to protect treasury demand. They also have to protect the stock market because that brings money in. But right now, they've done the right thing. They've raised interest rates to 2.5%. That's created continued demand for treasuries. All this dumping treasuries never happened. What's happened since then is the dollar has gotten stronger. It's created problems for emerging markets, and U.S. Treasury sales to foreigners and to Americans and to corporates are very robust, allowing the United States to have these multi-trillion-dollar deficits. But then the people are still saying, but the United States has got these trillion-dollar deficits, dollar collapse, game over, game changer, China to crush the dollar, end of dollar hegemony, gold, back yuan. No, all these other countries have printed, they're even worse off. Not only did they borrow more money, they owe it in dollars, which means there's a demand for dollars because these emerging market countries, including China, need dollars to pay off their debt. I don't know how people missed this, but they did. I guess when you're looking for a reason to gold to soar and the dollar collapse story is available, you use it. I've been saying that gold will soar not because of a dollar collapse, but because the collapse of the debt-based Ponzi scheme, if you will, in all the other countries, starting with China. That's what's happening now. The uncertainty is over China, not over the dollar. Look, what is Trump doing? He's saying, I want you to collapse the dollar. Not collapse it, but drive it down. The dollar is very strong today. If you've been listening to 8 years worth of gold pumper mentality stories, you're thinking, that's crazy. The dollar's not strong. The dollar's toilet paper. Who wants the dollar? The BRICS have had it. They're going to crush the dollar. Wrong. That's so far from reality. That's the exact opposite. But back then, clearly, everyone was concerned in the United States and the administration, Obama administration, Bernanke, Yellen. They had to undo what they had done with QE, or they could have lost the concept of the world reserve currency. They flipped that around. So back then, they couldn't allow gold to go higher. They had to chop it off at the knees. They had it, and silver just went along down for the ride. But today, it's different. Today, as the Fed is now looking like they're preparing to cut rates, maybe buy a bunch of assets, it looks like the ECB is going to continue with low interest rates. They're going to continue to buy corporate bonds. Japan's not slowing down. China, you can forget. I mean, China is going to print as many yuan as they can and forgive as much debt and build more highways to nowhere and skyscrapers. But today, no one seems to be worried that their currency is going to lose their status. They all seem to want to print more of it. Well, that's a great thing for gold and silver. That's a great thing for Bitcoin and Litecoin. Why? You've got countries that are making no effort whatsoever. It's out in the open. They don't care. The United States wants the dollar to fall. Well, if you want the dollar to fall, you print more of it. You can't print more of gold, silver, Bitcoin, Litecoin. Now, there's people who say, oh, you can't count Bitcoin, you can't count Litecoin, you can't count silver, you can't count gold. Enough people believe that in a negative interest rate environment, you're better off with a fixed asset. Some people believe in Bitcoin. Some people believe in Litecoin. Some people believe in silver. Some people believe in gold. I think the most obvious one for institutional money is gold. There's no two ways about it. There's a young group of people who are thinking it's Bitcoin. Not many people are thinking Litecoin, and silver, they don't really catch on until after gold goes higher. However, all four of them do share the characteristics. They're not the same. I'm not saying Bitcoin is digital gold or Litecoin is digital silver, but they're the same in the fact that they are limited in issuance, in that they have, in the case of Bitcoin and Litecoin, they have hard caps. In the case of gold and silver, they're subject to what's available and what they can possibly mine. But no country on earth today seems to have any interest in fiscal or monetary responsibility. Indeed, they're all concocting ways to print more money, figure out ways to buy more assets, and even give money away. I think that is a very bullish sign. Unless they decide to change that they don't want that to happen, I think it's very bullish for the precious metals and certain cryptocurrencies if these central banks and governments think that this is the way forward. Negative interest rates, buying assets, trying to create inflation. All right, let's see what y'all are thinking in the comments. Let's see, do we have comments? Live dashboard, here we are. Here we are. Here's our comments. Okay. Got to top to a lot of comments. All right. Hello, Phil McCain. Hello, Roger. And Pablo is saying he stacks Smaulgld Mugs. All right. All right. Fiona is here. Joshua Roberts, the only legitimate president in modern history, says Joshua, and the cartel decides to end their chaos trajectory and negative interest rate policy. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. As Trump announced what the new counter is. Yes, he has. No, actually, he hasn't announced the counter to China. He's told American companies to get the hell out of China. All right. Let's see, what else do we got? Any questions? Guys, gold predictions this year. Ann says 1,700. I would think, as I said, that we would have higher rates. That we would have higher gold prices this year. And if we do have higher gold prices, I think that we would have higher silver prices. And of course, that could happen with gold and silver, Bitcoin and Litecoin and other cryptocurrency. Again, not investment advice, just my point of view here. All right, what else do we have? Ken Inksa, Smaulgld, keep up the good work. Well, thank you. Anyone think something crazy may happen to gold to 5,000? Could happen. I mean, if indeed you get these blanket statements. Remember when they did QE, they were very nervous. Here's the difference. When the U.S. did QE in 2013, they were very clever about it. They kept talking about tapering it. So it never looked like this was it. And no other country was really doing it to the same extent as the United States. So when they announced QE3, even though it was big, they're always talking about ending it. And that's the yak attack. That's the Fed yak attack. That's the forward guidance. That's their way of setting expectation. Right now, all countries are setting expectation that they want to buy more assets, they want to print more money, they want to lower interest rates. So not only are they setting those expectations, they're actually going out there and doing it. So I think that actually, I'm surprised that we haven't seen bigger moves. I mean, today gold went up $30 and silver went up 40 cents. It's about 2.5%. And the cryptocurrencies were up just a little bit. Sometimes, this is a Friday. Sometimes people take a wait and see. They digest this news, and then you get a big move on Monday. Or who knows? That's just what I think is going to happen here. All right. Well, Joshua likes the show, but he used an expletive in his praise for the show tonight, and so I can't show it. It does end in a K. All right. What else do we have here? You guys are talking to yourself. That's good. Pablo says, good point, Lewis. I don't know when he was talking, but I'm sure it was a great point. ASMR people, I work for a U.S. company that makes stuff in China. Just give us 5 years and we can move production to another country. Yeah. And yes, I did get lost, Dan, but I caught it. That's another reason I don't like these YouTube live streams. I generally get cut off somewhere. And I know when I got cut off, I was saying, you see what it is? They're not listening. They're just certain words I think they don't like. And it always appears when I'm either making a point and maybe using a word. Who knows why it happens? But it does happen too much. Even if it's totally coincidental and it's got nothing to do with me and nothing to do with what I'm saying, it's still a flaw in the system. All right. Okay, what else do we have? Fiona Whalen. Martin Armstrong says U.S. is the prettiest of the three ugly sisters. Well, that's common. Everyone knows that. That's the point. That and everyone uses those trite analogies: the cleanest shirt and the dirty laundry pile, the best-looking horse in the glue factory. I don't have time for all those analogies. The point is, I like to look at them is that yes, they're all spending money, but the reason everybody still trashes the dollar in the U.S. is they're living in 2012 and 13. It's not that the United States has gotten its fiscal house in order. The Congress is still spending. They still have to do debt ceiling raises. They're still doing massive deficits. It's just that the Federal Reserve has been the most prudent bank in the last 5 years by raising interest rates and rolling off some of its balance sheet while other central banks are printing like mad. All right, we got to get going here. Anything else? A bunch of comments here. Well, that's about it. So, listen, tomorrow will be Saturday night silver with Smaulgld. We're going to go through and catch up on the silver. I'll do Sunday solid gold Sunday with Smaulgld on Sunday night. And then we'll see how it goes. So I want to thank everyone for joining me this evening. If you enjoyed this production, please consider supporting Smaulgld by becoming a patron. What do I have? Less than 20 patrons. That's not bad. I appreciate that. It'd be nice to get more. Subscribe star. All the information is below this BitChute and this YouTube and on the Smaulgld channel. You can support Smaulgld by sending a check or cash or items of value to Smaulgld LLC, P.O. Box 714, Dover, New Hampshire 03820. Or, as many people have done, I was just looking through, I've gotten over a dozen Litecoin donations in the last 6 months. You can hold up your phone with your Loaf wallet and make a donation that way. You can also do the same for Bitcoin at those QR codes you see on the screen. Or you can buy your precious metals through the Smaulgld affiliate links below this BitChute, below this YouTube, and on the Smaulgld site. So shop on the Smaulgld site. That does help Smaulgld out because I do get a commission from each and every sale. And you pay no more, no less than if you visited those sites directly. So thank you very much, and we will see you soon.